Hello, everybody. I'm Joel Iverson, a professor in communication studies from the University of Montana. And we are a panel of social scientists that came together through a Forest Service project that I will tell a little bit of the origin story for. And then each person is going to talk about some of the things that we do as a collective team. But we started in March of 2020, and we just realized this is the first time all of us have been together face to face. Like, whoa. And we've worked together since I think April of 2020 on a regular basis. So it's kind of neat for us. But what happened was actually Steve and I were at this conference in 2020. As many of you may have, how many of you were here in 2020 when the pandemic was just starting? And we were worried about surfaces and contact at that point and didn't really think about masks, right? I received a phone call from a person I had met in the Forest Service who is a risk scientist for the Forest Service. And he said, we're putting together a group of people to deal with COVID and wildland firefighting. Would you be willing to be on it? I said, yes. We met for 5 hours a day for about 2 weeks. And we came up with a plan for the Forest Service because wildland firefighting involves a lot of really close contact. We had a lot of high uncertainty. And so one of the things that I advise the executive leadership for the U.S. Forest Service, which is a organization that is part of USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, but it itself is 35,000 people or so, David? About 35,000 people. And we advise the chief of the Forest Service and their executive leadership. One of the things that I said was, with high uncertainty and being spread geographically across the entire US, you are going to be surprised. We don't know how you'll be surprised, but the more you can do to connect with people in the field and hear what's happening and how they are adapting, how you can adapt, how you can address issues, the better off you will be. We did not know that they had an organization called Innovation Organizational Learning, or I did not. But out of that recommendation, other people who did know what was available in the Forest Service, we developed a team. We developed a team of Forest Service personnel who did focus groups. And then each week we would analyze these focus groups. And I know later, are you giving the numbers in that? Sure. Yeah, on the number of focus groups we ended up. But let's just say every region, all 9 of the US, had a weekly focus group, and we would turn around weekly reports, and we did end up changing some policies in the process for the Forest Service and making a difference. We've since created a social science research group, and we have multiple projects that we're all doing with the Forest Service. So this all started really from, I think, this conference and connecting to the Forest Service, and now 4 years later, we're back. So we'll begin, first of all, with the one of us who is part of the Forest Service, Dr. David Flores, who is a PhD from the University of Michigan in sociology and is a research forester for the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which is located between my hometown of Missoula and partly in Fort Collins, Colorado. Go ahead, David.
Thanks. So yeah, as Joel was saying, this is this beautiful group of people up here are the folks who got together in 2020 to try and get information from people who were actually doing wildland fire work and find out how they were adapting to COVID-19 policies and guidelines. And things were changing weekly, as we all know. We were learning more and more about COVID, about spread. There was a lot of uncertainty going on. And really, the big question that was hovering over us is, what if there was a catastrophic wildfire and our entire response system went down because of COVID? What were we going to do, and what was this going to mean to communities? And so there were a lot of high-level CDC government policies coming down that were changing how people were doing their work day to day, because they couldn't stay at home. They needed to be out there doing the work of firefighting. So our job was really to go in to these different wildfire groups, learn about them, learn how they were adjusting to COVID-19 policies. So the Forest Service, it covers the management of forest lands across the United States. Organizationally, we have 9 regions in the country, and we cover over 191 million acres of land. So as you can imagine, it's a lot of people, it's a lot of communities that we engage with, and a lot of different cultures in different regions and how they were viewing COVID-19 and how they were adapting to COVID-19. So COVID, the challenge of dealing with COVID was one of many of the different challenges that we deal with in all of these communities. And we all are also structured like any government organization as a bureaucracy. And these are all the different groups within the Forest Service, the different agencies. And this is skipping without me touching it. So yeah, this is where it should be right now. So while we have different regions across the country, it can seem like they are we have a very decentralized sort of organization, but it's actually very hierarchical and there is a strict reporting structure. But at the same time, all of these different boxes have a lot of different things going on with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of responsibility. And how to communicate across these different groups was incredibly challenging, especially when the information was changing on a week-to-week basis. So that's where this team came in to try to make sense of some of this. And so really it came from a mandate from the highest levels of the Forest Service. Our chief said, we need to learn what works and what doesn't directly from firefighters. And we're gonna be setting up multiple ways to get that feedback. And so the primary way in which we decided that we were gonna get this feedback was through the process of focus groups. So we decided to conduct several focus groups across the country rather than send out a survey, because at the time, everybody was receiving a lot of emails about a lot of different information, and just sending another survey out would have just been click delete. But like Joel mentioned, we were connected to people who are in wildland firefighting and have close relationships with folks out in the field, and we were able to put together a series of focus groups to really find out how things were changing on a day-to-day basis. And what we really wanted to know was, how is COVID guidance being interpreted in the field by wildland firefighters? Just because a policy or a guidance is delivered doesn't mean that people are actually going to follow it to the T and that it's going to work out the way you planned for it to work out. How are firefighters adapting their management preparations and implementing these COVID-19 guidelines? Because as Joel mentioned, this is work that requires close quarters. People basically live with each other for a few weeks, and germs can spread pretty quickly. And all of a sudden they're being told that they need to physically separate from each other. And so how is this working out in the field? And what do the people out in the field need in order to be able to do their jobs? And so while these very straightforward questions to us at the time seemed very simple, they were incredibly challenging, and getting this information up to top levels of our organization was also very challenging. So through this focus group process, we partnered with a group within the Forest Service known as the Innovation and Organizational Learning Team. A lot of them consist of wildland firefighters. Of course, these were virtual meetings because we couldn't meet in person at the time. The people who participated in our focus group represented a diverse group of people in wildland fire, to people who work in the dispatch area, to people who fly airplanes and drop retardant on fires, to people actually out there clearing brush. We conducted an insane amount of focus groups. Anyone who's done 10 focus groups knows that's a lot of focus groups. We conducted 194 focus groups from March through October 2020. It wasn't just us, there was this Innovation and Organizational Learning Team. We did most of the analysis on that. And every week we were submitting reports to our senior leadership about how things were changing in the field. Of course, this consisted of qualitative non-numeric data, and our sample consisted of folks from all different levels of the Forest Service. While we have tons and tons of themes that emerge from this data. They do sort of fit under 6 general categories, everything from conflicting policies and procedures. So one week there would be one policy around COVID and fire, the next week a completely different policy or guideline on COVID and fire. And they went from 1 to 6 general guidelines that were that we found in the data. All the way down to the reduction or cancellation to pre-season training. And a lot of times in wildland firefighting, there's a lot of prep work that's done before the summer season begins. And this wasn't happening. They were being canceled. People weren't able to connect with each other, weren't able to get the training that they needed. So all of these different challenges, we were feeding it up to the top levels of the organization so that they can make adjustments in their policies and guidelines. And the advantages of this is it allowed us to communicate in real time what was happening on a week-to-week basis and communicate that not only vertically, but also horizontally across the agency. It allowed people to voice their beliefs in a safe setting. Being federal government, sometimes people don't want to say things in front of their superiors. And in the focus groups, they had the opportunity to voice their views. And they shared across the focus groups, and this was incredibly powerful. They were learning from each other as much as we were feeding information up the chain of command. They were all learning from each other. And it allowed people at the very bottom field level to communicate with senior levels of the administration. So that was really good. And then finally, we were able to capture how people were making decisions in with policy and the amount of space they had to be able to make these decisions, how their decision space conflicted or went along with their personal life and policy. And finally, at the center, number 4, is how they're operating at different moments of time with all of these intersections taking place. At the same time, thinking about their own crew, the people they're working with, and how they were just going to be able to do their job safely. And we, as I said earlier, we were producing weekly reports with internally to the agency, but we also have some publications that we've been able to produce. One is a Forest Service General Technical Report. We also produced a special issue in a journal called Fire Management Today, and we recently got a paper accepted in the journal Society and Natural Resources, and more publications are to come. And so that is a snapshot of our first big project working together around COVID.
To give you an example of that, before I pass this on to Rebecca, I was also still a part of the executive leadership team. We were called the Enterprise Risk Management Response Team. And one of the things that came out of the reports was there was a big surprise government snafu on testing and who would pay for it. The OWCP, I'm now acronym knowledgeable, which is basically the workers' compensation group that pays back medical bills, had a policy that treated it like a workplace injury. So if a wildland firefighter thought they might have COVID and they went to get tested and it was negative, it was just like you didn't have a workplace injury. So they were on the hook to pay for the test. If the test was positive initially, then they needed to prove that they got it on the job, which would be really hard to do with COVID. And that report quickly, by government standards, got back up to the leadership. And when we presented that, actually Chief Vicki Christian said, that's not okay. And within a month, we had a new policy. Well, we found an existing policy that said if the Forest Service had an interest, they would pay for testing. So there was a policy change that came out of these focus groups that the Forest Service would pay for any COVID test a wildland firefighter wanted to take. But now we're going to hear from Dr. Rebecca Fox from Texas State University, who also does a lot of other work with wildland firefighting. And you now have the call.
So I put the logo slide up here as a way to be able to tell you a few things. And so as David was explaining about our big COVID project, we recognize that this group is going to be important moving forward. And we've talked a lot about what does COVID 2.0 look like, and those kinds of things. And so we're really kind of positioning ourselves, looking forward to solving problems there in the future. And so part of what I wanted to mention today is kind of what I'm bringing to this group and what our potential is to solve problems moving forward. So I'm gonna start in the bottom corner here. I'm an AD, that means I'm an administratively determined employee with the Forest Service. So they can call me up whenever they need me, and if I can go, I can go. And so I'm out of the National Forest and Grasslands out of Lufkin, Texas on the Angelina Sabine National Forest. I'm also trained in international crisis and incident stress management. So I can help people with dealing with trauma and those kinds of things. And so those are the kinds of qualifications that I bring to the learning community. And that's mainly what I've done since about 2015 is being a part of this learning community. And so that's what I'm going to focus on telling you about in my presentation here. But I do want to draw your attention to the star that's on the left-hand side of this slide. And that's the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. And the reason that I want to draw your attention to this, it's a public-facing repository of all of the learning documents that the Forest Service produces. That means, for all of you researchers, a very rich data set that's public facing. And so any of our incidents, accidents, fatalities, near misses, anything that you would want to know about, it's public facing. And I think that this is a really important thing to mention because this shows the level of dedication that the Forest Service has shown in learning from accidents and those kinds of things, including the kind of work that we're talking about today. So overall, the goal that has the Forest Service goal, and then therefore my goal, has been to move away from a culture of blame and move into a culture of learning. And so recognizing times when we can do that specifically through continuously investing in the learning process. And I can also say that the Forest Service is a leader in that area. I've been a part of lots of different large organizations, and the resources that the Forest Service puts forth into the learning process is very impressive. And the way that we do this is from incidents, right? So everything that happens that we would consider an unintended outcome, we think there's something to learn. And so what I do mainly is I get on different kinds of teams, and I'm going to tell you about 2 different kinds of teams that I serve on, where we learn through interviewing, through storytelling, and sharing our lessons learned in order to progress in the learning community and share knowledge. So one of the things that I do, and this is kind of strange, it's always strange within the Forest Service, we name the process and the product the same thing. So I get on a rapid lesson sharing team, which is a process and a team name, and we produce rapid lesson sharing documents. So it's the process and the product. But what this is when there's a long fire season, and some of you may be familiar with these kinds of long fires that I'm talking about. Think about out west, but we've had them here in the South too. They're usually managed by an incident management team. And a safety officer is attached to those incident management teams. And if one of our firefighters gets injured or hurt or dies or anything that we don't intend to happen happens, the safety officer would be expected to find out everything that happened, do interviews and find out what happened, figure out what needs to happen. But what we've learned is that we can form these 2-person teams and we get pre-positioned within the region. And so they can dispatch us to go to any of the incident command posts and find out what happened. So we get there on the ground and the safety officer can keep their focus and attention on the fire, and we can take care of interviewing people and investigating and finding out what happened so that they are, maintaining their focus on the fire. So we're like these little surge ground safety teams, and we support the safety officers. And we produce these documents at a really fast turnaround. They're really quick, 3 to 5 pages usually, and we do them. I can be writing 3 or 4 of them. We go do interviews, go to the hotel at night, sometimes sleep at camp, and then we go and we're writing really fast, and then we go back and we produce these and we go wherever we need to go. The top right picture is of me, and that's at the Knoxville airport where it was a mobilization center, and I'm weighing in people's equipment so that they can fly in and out. That previous picture of the airplane was on the tarmac. I did not know that day that I was going to show up and weigh in people's gear, but as this little ground safety surge team, you do whatever you need to do. And so we're line qualified, and we are able to go and to do whatever we need to do. And so we're capturing lessons, and I've written them about tree strikes, vehicle accidents, civilian extractions, burn injuries, all those different kinds of things. And I want to tell you one really quick story. I could tell you stories all day long about some of the things that I've seen. It's some of the most fun. I'm sorry?
It's all about storytelling.
It is about storytelling. Yes, it is. But one of the things really quickly, and it has to do with communication. A couple of years ago, and I'm going to give you the very quick version of this. There was a firefighter who was injured using a drip torch, and she just received a burn injury. I won't go into all the details, but she went to the emergency room, and she knew that she had a pretty significant burn and that it was over the back of her knee. So a burn over a joint is a different kind of injury, different level of care and that kind of thing. Anyway, she went to the emergency room. The physician kind of laughed it off, said it wasn't that bad. She went back to camp later, and then they did a telehealth appointment with her physician, who told her that she needed to go to a burn center, and that she had major surgeries for several different days because she was really significantly burned. And what we were able to do is we interviewed everybody involved, and we figured out that one of the problems, wouldn't you know it, it was a communication failure within the emergency room, where they didn't want to get a referral to a burn center because that's a transfer of care from the attending physician into the burn center. But working with my medical professional friends in another community, that'd be my mom, who's an emergency room nurse. Tip of the hat to mom. She's like, no, they need to ask for a consult because it's not a transfer of care and it can't be denied. So the burn center can give the consult and there's no transfer of care. We wrote up a document that accompanies all of our burn protocols so that firefighters can go to the ER and say, we need to get the burn consult. And the ER physician can say, okay, we can do that. No harm, no foul, no transfer of care. It's just this little small communication kind of technique that allows people to get things done. So this is the kind of thing that we can do really quickly on these kinds of teams. I'll share more stories later if we have time. The next level up, so these rapid lesson sharing teams, 2-person teams, we go in and we just kind of respond to whatever we need to. That photo is flipped, trees don't go that way. I'm not sure why that happened in that case. That helicopter is actually on the ground. And so this is the next level up of the kinds of reviews that we do. And this is kind of based on severity. So an RLS is usually non-fatality oriented, facilitated learning analysis, a little bit more risk that's involved. A lot of times, sometimes we use them for fatalities, but near misses, serious injuries, and those kinds of things. We go in and it's a bit more involved of a type of investigation. We're on the ground for 10 days, maybe 14 days. We have a lot of subject matter experts. With the helicopter crash, we had regional aviation. We've done, UAS, like drones and those kinds of things. So depending on the nature and mechanism of the injuries and those kinds of things, we'll bring in subject matter experts. That's a motor grader operator in Oklahoma, or the motor grader that was burned over in a grass fire. Just to kind of show you the kind of expansion of that like burn protocol that I was talking about to the level of these kinds of accidents. So this facilitated learning analysis is a different kind of process that we do. There are other processes that we use in the Forest Service, but these are the 2 probably most common ones. So these 2 kinds of assignments are things that I do every year and kind of continuously. Another one that I do is I teach the Learning from Unintended Outcomes workshop. So twice a year, we train between 60 and 120 firefighters to go do the kinds of learning processes that I've been talking about. And so this is actually a picture of me in Orlando teaching that class. As we try and move it across the nation to get different firefighters from different regions. And so we go on the ground, we teach different people about this with the idea that we're, they can't just get the, several of us that are trained. We want everyone to do this. We want it to be much more of a grassroots kind of thing. So I go to the forest and then to the classroom, but that also preps me to be able to present, some of these findings in our journals. And I'm putting these up there just so that you can see that loop kind of is completed. So, using qualitative and rhetorical methods, particularly for me, to add to a lot of it has been HRO, but it's not just about high reliability organizations. It's a lot of times other kinds of things that we do. So just as, we would in an ecological way, thinking about the forest, you go from these, kind of high level conversations in our journals back to the forest. And that's what I'm doing right now. It's on these larger teams and we go into the different forests. There's a chief's call for every forest to be reviewed and every part of the forest to be reviewed. So not just the fire programs, the prescribed fire program, but the timber program, the endangered species and those kinds of things. So now I'm on a team and we go into every forest in the southern region. So you saw the 13 states plus Puerto Rico, and we go in and we analyze how all of the forest health is. And so what I think about when I come to this team is that I've spent time looking at these incidents and responding to accidents. And now I'm on these other kinds of teams where we're looking at the forest health and how that impacts every single thing that we're doing and our priorities and our learning culture.
And just for those of you who aren't familiar, the U.S. Forest Service is part of the, as I said before, part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It is separate. When you think of national parks, that is a completely different branch of government in the U.S. They are part of the Department of Interior. And they really do have different missions, and that timber component and other components of the Forest Service is something that makes it different than the parks area, as well as having a significant number of scientists in other areas and missions I'm still learning about. But yeah, each of us brings something different to this team and a different set of experiences. And at the end, we're going to talk about how we're going forward with our research, and we're always open to conversations with others. But now I'll turn it over to Jody John, who is a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and her experiences and her research around wildland fire.
Thank you, Joel. So I started off, I grew up in a Forest Service family. My dad was a lifelong land manager with the US Forest Service. And when I was 15, I was in driver's ed, and it was early July. It was the year was 1994. The skies were red with smoke, and my dad picked me up from driver's ed that day. Normally I had to ride my bike. It was 5 miles each way, and I had to go into town twice. So I was riding 20 miles a day on my bike, but that day I got a ride. But the reason he picked me up was because a good friend of his, the son of a good friend of his and a good hunting buddy of his had disappeared in a fire in Colorado. And it turned out that that was the South Canyon fire of 1994 that killed 14 wildland firefighters. And so when my dad picked me up that day, he said, you know, I want to see if you want to go on a road trip with me to visit the families of the people that I know who lost folks. And I said, sure. You know, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And it was that trip was a really important bonding moment for me and my dad. I was really into Enya at that time. The album Orinoco Flow really got some airplay on that trip. So but we visited these families, and it was really, really impactful for me to be in the presence of loss from fire. And that South Canyon incident ended up kind of following me throughout my research career, and even today. I ended up going into fire right after high school, and I spent 8 seasons as a wildland firefighter. I worked on every kind of crew except for smoke jumping. I rappelled out of helicopters, worked on an engine, worked on hand crew, did a brief stint in detail, you know, a temporary like detail stint on hotshot crew, and collected a lot of experiences and a lot of stories that have informed every question that I've asked in my research to this day. So the kind of central nucleus of my research is really on wildland firefighting team or crew dynamics. And what I've always been interested in, or what I became interested in, it's not like I had the interest and I was like, oh, I have this interest, I'm going to go to grad school and study this. It was more like the interest that unfolded was around safety rules. I was interested in the ways that safety rules and other guidance seem like black and white things to follow, but when it comes down to it, it's really situational, it's very cultural, and a lot of what your decision premises are informed by the people that you directly hold yourself accountable to. That's your team members, your crew members. And so that's a big part of what I've been studying. Part of it has been how do wildland firefighting teams translate safety rules into action in their everyday practices? How do they bring them up in conversation? How do they converse back and forth? And why do they not in some cases too? So I look at the different dynamics in the crews that inform whether you have more of a learning culture in your crew, where you have more dialogue, where you're actually talking things through. There's more of a mentor-mentee type of repartee, as opposed to groups that have more seasoned members, that are more expert, that don't necessarily want to run things by each other. Or if they do, it kind of damages their sense of credibility in that moment. So really trying to understand those dynamics has been a big part of the work I do. But as I've been looking at safety rules, the other thing I'm interested in is some of the changes that came about because of the South Canyon fire. The report, the serious accident investigation report that came out of it, in effect blamed the firefighters for their deaths. So the way that the investigation went is they looked at they had a list of the safety rules, and then they looked at the events and they said, okay, which safety rules were violated, quote unquote violated. Check, 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 check. okay, well, it looks like the firefighters caused their own death, so boom, done. And that caused a huge shift in the wildland fire community. That accident report was a major turning point toward what the Forest Service calls, now, well, I don't know if they really call it this anymore, but back in 2004, they rolled out this policy called Doctrine, which said, you know, we're not looking at safety rules as a compliance violation type of thing. We want to bring in firefighter judgment in the moment to be able to follow rules that make sense in the moment and disregard ones that don't make sense. And so I've followed that transition, that entire technical documentation cycle from the policy to the training, to the local documentation, to the types of questions that are asked in an investigation. So that shift from what went wrong or who messed up to, what about these actions made sense in the moment? What is it about the events that played out that are normal for this work? And that's kind of the undergirding of what Rebecca is working on. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not taking credit for it, but I'm looking at those foundational aspects. So that's another thing that I'm interested in, is really like following that all the way through, to, you know, not only what kinds of questions are being asked in those, we don't call them investigations anymore, but learning reviews or rapid lesson sharing. And then what are the products that come out of that? How are they framed? And one of the things that we've seen, or one of the things that the Forest Service is doing, and why they're such an innovative learning organization, is that they shifted from a single like root cause, single voice analysis type of report to this multivocal narrative. So you have kind of, you're still working with a timeline typically, but you have different people's perspectives at different times, and then they tie it all together, and it's really an interesting kind of art form that they're creating with that. And so then, you know, I've got my safety rules thread, but then there's also the team culture thread. And what I've been looking at over the past, I guess 3 or 4 years now, has been diversity, equity, and inclusion in wildland firefighting teams. And what we're interested in here is the idea that safety has to, you know, you have to have DEI in place in order to have a safe work environment. And so what we've been doing is I've been working with Matthew Carroll. He's a former smoke jumper and a researcher in the Forest Service who wears many hats. And what we've been looking at is some interesting dynamics within the wildland fire community around DEI. So on one hand, we have tension at the frontline level among firefighters, where there's a sense that diversity initiatives disadvantage people who qualify for the job. That there's a tension around this idea of reverse racism and reverse sexism being in place. And then on the other hand, you have women and firefighters from underrepresented groups who feel all this resentment being directed at them on one hand, and then every time they walk into a room, they feel like they have to prove themselves again, that there's always this threshold of doubt that they have to overcome in order to prove that they belong in their role. And so we've been understanding the dynamics around that. And then at the same time, we've been working with, we recruited 6 wildland fire crews of different kinds and we're working with them to understand what are their routines and practices for how they run their culture, and where can we intervene in those practices to make them more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And so what we're doing essentially, I mean, for all the social scientists in the room, is we're creating conceptual definitions for what the diversity, equity, and inclusion are, but then also operationalizing those into actions and patterns of action. And we're understanding, okay, what does that look like when it's working well? What does it look like when it's not working well? And then how can we make small, powerful changes that can enhance that culture in intentional ways? So those are my main areas. I also have done a little bit of work around intractable conflicts around land management for regarding, clear cuts and fuel, like removing fuels around a town, the town I currently live in now. I never thought I'd live there. I thought everybody there was crazy, but now I live there and I love it. But following this intractable conflict and working with land managers to understand the lines of argument that they make to the public really matter. So in the project that I was working on with this, you know, the people would say, please don't do this clear cut near my land. It's gonna ruin the viewscape. And then the land managers would come back and say, well, this is the proper thing for this ecosystem. And then people would say, no, but it ruins my viewscape and it's really meaningful to it. And then they'd be like, the land managers would say, yeah, but it's a fire, it's for fire protection, you know? But what it really was it was a place attachment issue. And the people who lived in that environment really, they wanted to protect what they valued about that landscape. And there needed to be a place in that conversation to allow for those issues to come up and be addressed in a real way. So those are some of the things that I do, and it all kind of ties in to our group here.
It does, which is why being completely new to fire in March of 2020, it was a great opportunity to get to work with people who do a lot of firework. David Flores warned me as we were talking about setting up this 194 research group, focus group process. We didn't know it was going to turn into 194 focus groups and other interviews. But he said, once the Forest Service gets its hooks in you, brother, there is no getting out. And Steve and we're all living examples of that process. And he was right, and we really enjoy it. So Steve, and I guess I'm chiming in with you on our process, but Dr. Steve Bennett is professor in communication at the University of Southern Mississippi, and he and I work together doing a fair bit of other training and communication analysis around the wildfire crisis strategy. For some of you, for terminology, I used to have a second screen of acronyms and other terms to look up to understand. So when Jody talks about smoke jumpers and hot shots, smoke jumpers are the people who parachute into a fire. It was invented in Missoula, where I live now. They're very proud of it. From a risk perspective, I think it should be translated into drones, but that exists. Hot shots are a higher level trained crew as well. So there's a lot of language and acronyms to learn to be able to engage in this research and engage in this project. But Steve, you want to start?
Sure. So those of us who study risk and crisis communication or are involved in the practitioner side of things, we've been saying for 20 years now that crises are epistemic. And by that, we mean that not only do crises challenge our very understanding of our contexts, our organizations, but they also challenge our ways of understanding. That every once in a while, things break down so much that you have to start over at ground zero. One thing that I really appreciate about the U.S. Forest Service is that they are dedicated to be a learning organization. How many different branches of the Forest Service have we identified in the last few minutes that have learning directly in their acronym? I think it's impressive that they recognize that they face so many different contexts that are defined by uncertainty that they take time to think about what has happened, what's gone well, and what hasn't gone well. And they incorporate that into the very decision-making that they do as an organization. I think that's very impressive, and it allows us as scholars and people that are working on the theoretical side of things to take their practical wisdom and to help to contribute our understanding to the academic side of things so that we can help them as subject matter experts and they can help us by their practical knowledge and wisdom that they've developed over a very long period of time. So Joel and he gave us a little bit of our origin story with the U.S. Forest Service, but part of the work that we do with the enterprise risk management team is dealing specifically with training. And that group of people, they listen to communication scholars, which is, I don't know, that's a good thing.
I don't know if
happens every once in a while.
We
right?
appreciate it. Yeah.
Right. But they saw the value in what we brought to the table, and they said, well, I think that we need to incorporate some of the things that you're saying into the training that we do. And so they asked us to develop some training material for their line officer academy, which is where they send people in the organization that are moving up the chain of command, and they're starting to become rangers, and the people that you see if you go to the national forest, the people that have more of a leadership position. And also they asked us to develop material for their senior leader program. And so we were able to put together material that talked about enterprise risk management that directly emerged out of the focus groups that we analyzed. And in particular, it has to do with the frustration that was seen in the field level where people were voicing their concerns. And it was going up the chain of command, but they didn't always see how their opinions and their thoughts were being acted on by the organization, because certainly in a large governmental organization, decision-making doesn't always happen very rapidly, right? And so there isn't immediate turnaround to give them feedback that things were changing. So one of the things that we actually talked about in the training material is how thinking changes at the various levels of the organization. From the line level, where you see how do you put things into practice? Like, should you wear a mask when you go to fight a forest fire? That's not something that I would have thought about, right? It turns out that it's kind of a challenge to hike into a forest or into a grassland.
Some of us, it's a challenge without the mask, so, you know.
Yeah, I had problems when there's a sidewalk, right? So it's a whole different thing when you're going up the side of a mountain. And then to be told that you have to wear personal protective devices at the same time, it gets to be a whole different ballgame, right? And so those kind of decisions are being made in the field. But the way that people think about it on an organizational level is very different when you get up to the enterprise level of an organization. So the very top level of leadership looks at things differently when they're trying to make decisions. And so sometimes just explaining that process to people and how people are looking at it and touching it from different angles helps them to understand that even though you don't see a decision take place right away, doesn't mean that your feedback's not important, right? You're still a part of the decision-making that's taking place. You're still contributing your knowledge. And in the work that we did also, it helped to highlight that it starts to become part of the institutional knowledge. Right? So it becomes organizational learning that's happening from a grassroots perspective. The things that they did that were innovative, things that they did to meet new challenges, now became part of their repertoire of tools that they can use going forward. And so capturing those comments that people had not only was useful in helping them to make sense of what was going on in an uncertain environment, but it also helps to give a new foundation for gathering knowledge in the future.
Right, so some of the training we did were on decision-making processes, on communication, and doing those trainings. At the same time, we still meet as a national level consulting group as SMEs, subject matter expert. I always thought that wasn't that Captain Hook's sidekick in Peter Pan was SME? But we're SMEs. And we helped them identify 6 long-term risks that the agency faces going forward. And they identified one of them as communication, right? I think ranked wise, we're number 4, but it's integrated into all of them. And they know that's a problem, but they don't know what they mean by communication. They certainly don't know how to fix it or to understand it as an ongoing process. So part of what we do is talk about risk communication as a part of risk mitigation, rather than seeing it as a legal issue. So if you communicate about risk, it's its own risk, or that risk communication only happens when there's an immediate crisis, or crisis communication happens then, and to get them to apply things like the best practices and other things that have come out of our field. So we're gradually getting to work some of that into those trainings and other issues. So Steve and I we were both on sabbatical last year, and we did, I don't know, 5 or 6 trainings in different parts of the US. It was really neat. And then the other thing that happened is, if you had watched the news for the US, the Forest Service really made a pledge to create this wildfire crisis strategy that brought in a lot of money from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it was just over 5 billion to the Forest Service to start to do things differently on 23 direct landscapes. And I was part of the rollout for that in presenting. They used the phrase paradigm shift 14 times in talking about that. So let's talk about what a paradigm shift really is. And let's talk about how communicating differently and framing differently changes different possibilities. So one of the other things that Steve and I put together, well, it started, I was in Spain as part of a group going over there to see wildland fires, and I needed something to say. And I looked at that, they have a lot of the same problems we have with fire. So we said, you know, we looked at the way that they were framing disasters, and it's the one natural disaster. A lot of you do natural disaster work, right? In hurricanes and other things. And nobody says, well, let's go stop that hurricane, right? And when you say you can't, they don't say, well, what if we get more people and equipment and airplanes? Now let's go stop that hurricane. But with wildland fire, it's the one that we think we can stop. And that is not true, right? I mean, you can eventually remove the fuel out of its way so it has nowhere else to go. But there's this expectation that we can fix it. And they really created this narrative frame that a lot of people write about, including people up here, called the War on Fire frame. And we talked about framing, and we talked about narratives, and where does that position the Forest Service and wildland firefighters? Where does it position the public? Steve brought in some of his work on efficacy that says, much like in health communication, we talk about individual efficacy. Steve has work that looks at system efficacy. And with the War on Fire, it's all system efficacy. The expectation is other people will take care of this wildland fire, right? And we said, actually, we need to shift our framing to understanding wildland fire is natural. It is part of the ecosystem in the west of the US. And that it's much like the analogy that I use very quickly are the bears. When I moved to Montana, I noticed in the fall, bears would show up and get into my garbage because they're getting ready to hibernate over the winter. Well, the bears are just being bears. I need to change my behavior. Some of you heard us talk about this in Sweden at the ICREA crisis conference, but it's really getting humans to behave differently and think differently. I change my behavior, and then the bears don't have a picnic in my yard, right? I put my garbage in the garage. So we helped them shift to asking the questions, what will wildland fire when it arrives to this piece of ground? The second part of it is the team of scientists we work with called the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team, part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, is also what will wildland fire find, or what are you leaving for the next wildland fire? So putting every fire out in the smallest footprint is not the best strategic option at all times, depending on the weather and conditions. So how do we think not just for now, but to start to make policy decisions and actions and choices in a strategic way to think beyond this wildfire to the future? And we've started to do some of that work as well. So each of us in this team have different roles and connections, but we're also coming together and we're starting a new set of projects. And there are other people here, like later you'll hear Sylvie Costin present on her work on communities. She's part of the University of Montana Communication Program and comes with a lot of experience from the Nature Conservancy. There are a lot of partners. Wildland fire is a very complex issue, which means it's right for us to study. And as a team, we're going forward to do that, right?
Yeah.
Do we have another slide?
We have a slide to get us into a discussion, a conversation, because we've been going for a while. So what's next? Everybody's gonna, folks are gonna continue to work on their projects, to do trainings, to work with crews on crew dynamics. So we all have our respective projects going on, but how us as a group are moving forward and this is still half-baked, and we can totally use your input for this. But moving forward with communities of practice and moving from gathering information, analyzing that information and learning and putting that out on documents so that we can learn, to how we continuously get folks to share their learning across the organization. And there are different communities of practice taking place within the Forest Service, and a lot of them are siloed. And so moving forward, what we would like to do is sort of infiltrate these different communities of practice and get them to start sharing their learning with each other. And a lot of it is around wildfire risk. It's internal for the most part to the Forest Service. But we also, as I mentioned during my discussion, we have a lot of different stakeholders who we work with. And so how do we learn from each other across these multiple groups? So that's sort of the direction that we're moving. And we really want to put the practitioners at the forefront. So it's not about us developing the research questions and going into these different communities of practice and telling them what they need to do. It's not about that. It's about practitioners letting us know what are the biggest challenges for them out there. What do they really want to know? And for us it's on us to develop our research questions around that. And we really want to develop this learning platform where different communities of practice around wildfire can engage and learn from each other, so that we could continue to build upon what the Forest Service is trying to establish, and this culture of learning that we've been talking about. And then recruiting the next generation of diverse researchers around wildfire, because there is a tremendous lack of diversity within wildfire fighting, but also within wildfire research, social science research around wildfire. And so we really want to address that gap as well as we move forward, because if we're going to approach these complex problems, we need to have complex people from different lenses that can provide us different types of information to think about this in other ways. And so while the Forest Service has done a lot, it's not perfect by any means. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of challenges within the organization. And so we're kind of nudging it to in that direction of being more of a learning group, more of a learning organization. So yeah, we went on for a while.
But we have like
Yeah,
25 minutes left for
we still have-
questions
we still have
still.
time
So
for-
I feel pretty good about that. Questions, comments, thoughts?
In the back,
Oh, yes.
did you have a question?
No? Okay.
I can start. I comprehend the need to work with the natural development of forests, and that this is a naturally occurring event, just like floods,
Mhm.
not just like this. In that vein, how do you foresee educating your stakeholders about where they build, how they build, in terms of flowing with the natural progression of forests, so that we don't build houses that are in a place that is just wrong.
We already did that. We already did too many of those.
But I mean, I listen to you and I listen, bring your.
Yeah.
Side, and don't have fuel by your house, growing, but I was just like, gee, how, new developments going in, and then.
Yeah.
Do you,
I do.
Yeah, go for it.
I can go. Well, first of all, there's many different community types. So when we're talking about people who live next or near national forests or wild areas, right? There are different types of communities. There's farming communities, there's ranching communities, more rural type communities. They tend to be better prepared and will have more knowledge about how the landscape works and use fire in their favor for what they need. A lot of times they don't need the Forest Service, they don't need federal government resources, because they have a lot of those resources. Sometimes they do need a little bit, but they don't want too much, just enough. And then there's other communities that are like newer developments, right? That may not be as aware of the risks of fire near their communities. So there's just every type of community is gonna require a different type of approach. And so how we engage those stakeholders is gonna look different on these landscapes. And so that is a major challenge for the Forest Service, because as a government organization, having one policy that fits all is the easy way to do it. But as we learned in our research with COVID, and as we learn when we continue to work with stakeholders, is that each community has a different culture, has a different working relationship with the landscape. There are different aesthetics that they value about the forest. So we need to have different communication strategies developed in these different types of landscapes.
Yeah, I've got a couple more things to tack onto that. Two things. One, I think that wildland urban interface communities or communities that are near forest or other wild lands are gonna feel the pinch, or already are feeling the pinch of insurance costs. And we're seeing that more even on the flats because of the Marshall Fire that
Right.
destroyed 1,100
Mhm.
homes just right outside of Boulder. Just your typical suburb, just burned to the ground. Back in 2 years ago, something like that, right before New Year's Eve, I think it was, or anyway, something like that. But so I think people are feeling the pinch of insurance costs, and I think ultimately that's probably what's gonna drive people being more interested in being proactive about managing their land, so that they build more defensible spaces. But another thing that I've been doing in some outreach work with homeowners associations that are on the edge of the wildland urban interface is to get them thinking about their HOA as a single unit, as a system, because it only takes that one house that hasn't been maintained to put the whole neighborhood at risk. And so shifting that thinking from individual responsibility to the whole HOA or that whole neighborhood has been an important shift. But I also think, a couple interesting insights that came out of my research on the intractable conflict around fuel treatments around this kind of more mountain community was that the people who had neighbors relatively close by were more open to these fuel treatments. It was those houses that were in those mining claims that were checkerboarded within that federal land, that public, where they had a lot of surface area of public-private boundary. Those were the folks that were the toughest to deal with, because they said, look, I choose to live here. I know there's a risk. I accept the risk, hands off, And so those were the toughest stakeholders to really work with. And they were some of the least informed about how natural processes work as well. So they, in large part, came from areas that don't burn like Colorado burns. They were from, upper East Coast, they see green trees and they thought, oh, this is a healthy forest, don't touch the trees. But they don't realize that, in that particular ecosystem, it's designed for the trees. It's a lodgepole pine ecosystem is designed for the trees to grow up together and then just completely all burn down together too. And if your house is in the middle of it, your house is going too. And people just don't quite understand those dynamics, I think.
Another thing to add to that. So how many of you have done a house remodel or built a new home? Some of you, many of you. So the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Agency, who sets fire code for buildings that tells you where you have to have a GFI outlet and how close it can be to a water feature in your home and those kinds of things. That's code, that's law. The WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface that Jody was talking about, we don't have a standardized WUI code that says legally you can or cannot build in these certain areas. You can only build with these kinds of materials and that kind of thing, which makes this group even more important because we don't have a legal restriction, we have persuasion, right? We have to work with people and use communication resources to convince people and to get over some of the hurdles that Jody's talking about.
Yeah, and that's a tough hurdle to cross. One of our colleagues, who's a professor at Oregon State, was part of a state project that was doing, they decided to create a state map, a state risk map of wildland fire. And as they were introducing that to different communities, especially if you recall, internationally, even in the news, there were parts of Eastern Oregon where they took over some federal land with guns. and didn't want the government involved in their lives, they literally had to cancel the community meetings because of death threats. That people don't want that kind of interference, and the fear is, what are they going to do with that risk map? So it's not simply giving people information, but it's bringing them along in values and understanding, with what is acceptable risk. So good question. And the answer is a lot of research potential for all of us.
Mhm.
And you had a question as well.
Hello, my name is Bianca. I study risk and crisis communication of government communication about wildfires in Portugal. Congratulations for your work. You have a very integrated approach on your research. So it's very, very nice to see research being developed like this. I would like to ask if your research group have website, kind of a place where I can find your publications or reports or anything like this.
We should set that up.
Yeah,
That's a
we need
great
to-
idea.
That's part of our goal so there's communities of practice research that is gonna move forward. This is a project we're gonna start in the fall. So that's sort of the chapter 2. We were sort of thrown together around 2020 with the COVID incident, and we've been working on different projects since then. And this will be sort of the next phase of us moving forward as a team together in the fall and putting together not only a research team, but how we disseminate our information is going to be a very important piece to this.
Yeah.
So establishing a website, probably a university website, not a government website, and sharing our not just our publications, but I think sort of materials that are informative to practitioners that can
I would.
one or
But
two
if
page sort
you
of documents.
want
That's our movement forward.
Yeah.
Until we get that set up, you can contact any of us
Okay,
and we'll give you,
I
Yeah.
contacted you, okay.
yeah.
And if you want, you can, at least for those 3 primary publications, if you look up David Flores at the Rocky Mountain Research Station at the Forest
Look at that.
Service.
There you
Yeah, you can get a hold of him there. But a lot of the work, honestly, like Stephen and I are doing with that training, we haven't written anything up with it because we're primarily subject matter experts. And now we're starting to turn that into publications. So we're doing the work first, developing the materials and ideas, and then turning it into academic output. So it's very different than a traditional grant in that way, which I kind of enjoy at this point in my career. Yeah.
Maybe should be for David, more from an organizational perspective, and we know that it's always very challenging to change culture. There was a slide that says from a culture of blame to a culture of learning, I think. What is the department doing, like practically, to kind of create that open environment where people can, report risks without feeling fear of retaliation and things like that? How that environment is being created, if it's been created already, or if there are plans to do that.
Well, I'll let Rebecca go after me because you talked about the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center, but in this culture of learning tends to be within our organization strongest within the wildland fire fighting community. So there are different, when I showed that organizational chart earlier, there are different branches of the Forest Service doing different types of work. And within our wildland firefighting work, that tends to be our highest risk work, and where this culture of initially there was shame and blame earlier, and now it's evolved to a culture of learning. But there's still a long way to go for the rest of the organization, I would say. And it is sort of filtering slowly across. And from my perspective, from where I stand, a lot of it has to do with communicating clearly with our senior leadership and where they hold this value to be important. And in an organization that's a government organization, has that hierarchy, when it is being sponsored from the top, then people will tend to buy into it a little bit more. So there's this definitely started at a lower level, but it has filtered up to the top levels of the organization, and there's still resistance.
Yeah.
As I said, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There are people that have been doing it this certain way for 20 years and they're not gonna change. And that is definitely there. But we like to say that change happens one retirement at a time. There are newer generations that do buy into this and.
Yeah, but when you mentioned that you're like planning, like hiring the new generation or, you know, so
Yeah.
that's part of that.
That's
cultural
part of
change.
it. That's
Yeah.
part of it, yeah.
And to say, like, upper level decision making, it also depends on who's in a leadership role and who's willing to take risks, because there is a history of getting punished for taking risks amongst the decision makers around wildland fires. So with this new wildfire crisis strategy and new targets being set in different landscapes, you know, we've discovered, we were invited to speak in Arizona not that long ago. They burned more than they ever have before, and they want to still double what they've been doing in order to get fire on the landscape, to improve the ecosystem, and to be strategic about where they're choosing to try to stop the fire. But other regions, their attitude is, that's risky, and I don't, even though the chief said we need to do this, if we do and something goes wrong, I'll be in trouble. And so getting that change to happen is very much a ground up, and it's different in different regions. And we're really pushing some of those regional leaders in the West to lead, to create pressure on the national level to do more to support them.
One of the things that is a part of the senior leader training that Will and I have been doing is how is it that you go about assessing decision-making in high uncertainty contexts? And we have been working on establishing that we should assess decisions not by the outcome, but rather in the process that's being used, right?
Yeah.
And so that is a new idea for most of the people, but I think that ultimately that is going to have a long-term effect as those people move up the chain of command.
Or out, like David said.
Right.
Good.
What I would add about that is, one of the things that I teach in the Learning from Unintended Outcomes workshops, and by the way, the folks that come into that class every year, you can, an engine captain and a district ranger, FMOs, you know, force management officers, force supervisors, everybody comes into that class. And so teaching a diverse group of people the priorities and the foundations of learning, which creating trust and those kinds of things, and having that happen in that way is important. But what I say is, if you want to change the culture, you change the stories you tell about the culture. And so not just per incident, what story are we telling about how this incident unfolded? If we tell a story that makes someone look ridiculous, oh, I can't believe they did that. We've not told a story about a real person that went through a very bad thing. So we have to be careful about how we talk about incidents. We also have to be careful about how we talk about our culture. And so making sure that we're aware and we're conscious and we're cultivating that in a proper way. The other thing I would say is, whenever we are trying to figure out the new, you know, groups, that your second part of your question, how are we bringing new people in? When I go on RLSs and FLAs and I show up and I'm at, you know, in command and I'm interviewing people, you know, very dirty firefighters standing right in front of me and I'm talking to them and they're like, what are you doing? Like, who are you? You know, they know I'm an academic. They see that I'm in fire boots and they're like trying to put this back together. And I explain it to them. And then they'll say, how do I do that? And then I'm like, okay, we'll come to the lesson, you know, so we're always constantly getting people involved in this, and especially folks that, you know, may not have thought that that was going to be in their path, and to make it something that's very common. Everyone's responsible. The last thing I'll say is those RLSs, rapid lesson sharing. You don't have to have a team come out to do this. On that Wildland fire lessons learned, the repository, the lessons learned center, there's a button that you can hit anonymously if you so choose. Any firefighter, anybody can send in a rapid lesson sharing. This is what I've seen. Here's what I think we need to share. It does get vetted through the editors, just to make sure that we're staying within policy. But that is a very kind of open, you know, kind of gesture that we want everyone to be a part of this culture.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? We have, yeah.
Well, not so much a question, but just a reflection. that's more on, I like the idea of using storytelling
Yeah.
to generate all these lessons and insights. And what is important as well, and that was triggered by your remark about retirements, is that people who leave the company or an organization also, then also some of the lessons leave the organization. So it also needs some effort to keep them alive, also on the long run. And you think you can use storytelling for that perhaps as well.
You know,
Perhaps even people, firefighters who left already 10 years ago, but bring them back home. Okay,
Yeah.
tell us what happened at that large fire.
yeah, one of the pieces that you saw, I kind of left the reference up there. It was a data set that a friend of mine who was a FBAN, fire behavior analyst, long time. He interviewed people that had been in fire management for 30 years or more, right before they retired. And got insights. How were you able to survive in this really dangerous and very, you know, stressful environment for so long? And gathered those lessons together. So I think it's a commitment to consistently not letting that information and that knowledge leave, and to making that a part of our story. We value those lessons. We don't say, okay, goodbye, we're on to the next thing, we want
We
to
did
go.
it wrong at the time and now we're doing okay. now.
Right, yeah, we want to keep it, yeah.
Yeah, one of the dangers, though, of people from the past who've done things in the older ways of always suppressing every fire, for example, is that one of the louder groups are former wildland firefighters, and you get a mixture of opinions. And one of the things we're combating are a few very loud people who are pushing for a policy return to what they call the 10 a.m. policy, which is put every fire out by the next day at 10 a.m. or have it under control, right? And some of those counter voices are proving to be challenging for us.
You know, but that's also about the culture of evaluation. Sometimes you have, in some countries, you have these gold commanders and we're not going to be evaluated because, well, I'm a gold commander, so I'm just taking the right decisions, otherwise I wouldn't have been the gold commander.
Yeah.
You really have to break through.
Yeah. And walking that fine line of, yes, you're heroic, right, as a wildland firefighter.
Well,
You
you were
did what
lucky.
you were asked to do, but what you did is made our problem today worse, right? By the way, that's a tough needle to thread from a narrative perspective.
Yeah, and another angle on that is when we talk about the safety rules in wildland fire, that it's commonly said that they're written in blood. I mean, every rule that people have to follow is because somebody died or because somebody was seriously injured. And so there are stories with why you need to have an escape route and a safety zone and lookouts and communication. And it's not just theoretical ideas that make sense. People died. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is it's more than just the narrative. The narratives are important, but it's really understanding how do you keep those lessons alive in practice? How do you keep that safety rule or the lived experience of running from using that escape route that you didn't think you'd need, and feeling that in your body, and then making sure that makes it into everyday practice every time. You know, how do they do that in crews? So
yeah, my own experiences as well. If you use storytelling to generate these lessons, it's no longer about right or wrong, taking the right or wrong decisions as you do. Well, it's more about, okay, what were the dilemmas, the operational dilemmas you had, and it gives a completely different kind of stories, and that helps to change that.
but firefighters don't like telling their stories. That's one of the things I learned when I did interviews with them. Yeah, I actually interviewed people from a crew I worked on. I knew people really well. And I was like, I cannot believe you never told me the story. And they're like, yeah, I don't be that guy in the yellow shirt just telling stories by the campfire, you know? So they're reluctant to actually bring those in, but it would be really powerful if they did.
So you all have put together this incredible team that has people inside the entity and outside the entity and straddling both sort of in and outside the entity, and have been able to do these incredible things over the span of several years. But it seems like it sort of was right place, right people, right time. And it just sort of happened. And so my question is, and maybe that's wrong, but how might this be replicable across contexts so that similar groups of social science researchers could be working to help folks who work on invasive species management, who work with folks who do very important kinds of things, but where there's this sort of separation?
I've been thinking about that. Not saying I haven't answered, Andrew, but it is kind of emergent. And as I was thinking about, like, what is consistent across this is willingness to take on opportunities that at the time, you don't see a direct payoff, like, can I get a publication out of this, right? Am I willing to go sit in this meeting? Is what we're saying valuable and other people are making asks? You know, this emerged out of, it actually took a person I work with quite a bit, her name is Jane Darnell. It took Jane Darnell and I think a good hour to talk you into considering commanding this team.
It's a lot of work.
Right? But eventually saying yes, so it is emergent, right? But it's taking advantage of opportunities, and honestly, people talk about boredom in the pandemic. We were not bored, we were super busy, and that was great, but then just think about where we can take it next.
I guess another like piece to sort of end on a motivational note is, you know, the folks we work with, they're in the natural resources, like they studied, you know, soil, fish, right? They're not social science trained. And I have found that there's a hunger for wanting to understand what we're studying, what we work in. And so I think that when you can partner with someone in the natural resources area or in the physical sciences, I think and you can find that what you can do can complement each other. I think that's where there's opportunities to create these kinds of teams. You know, when you can find someone who's open to like, yes, there's something about social science. I don't really know very much about it, but I know that we need it. And I know that it's going to be useful for what we're trying to do. When you can find that person to partner with, I think that's where you can create these kinds of teams that will develop this type of work. And in emergency management, there's a ton of practitioners out there who don't have the social science skills, don't have the research communication skills. And so that's where I think there's a way to move forward.
And the origin story is Steve Annette was visiting Scholar in Missoula. We were at a brewery called Great Burn after the big fire, and we happened to be talking to somebody I knew, and her husband happened to be a risk scientist for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. We happened in October of 2019 to talk about risk and communication, and he's like, we don't have that, we need that. So when the opportunity showed up in March of 2020, he called.
So the lesson is drink more beer.
Go to breweries. It's your best pathway to research success. Thanks, everybody.